Somewhere right now, someone is lying awake at 3 in the morning thinking about the person they chose, running the calculations, replaying the early days, wondering, in the quiet honesty of sleeplessness, whether they made the right decision. Whether the person sleeping beside them is really the person they were supposed to end up with. Whether there is, somewhere out there, a version of their life that went differently and felt more right. This is one of the most private and most universal experiences of modern adult life. The quiet regret about a life partner, the wondering, the what if, and surveys consistently show that somewhere between 20 and 40% of married adults report significant regret about their choice of spouse at some point in their marriage. Not all of them leave. Many of them stay for decades with this feeling quietly running underneath everything. Your ancient ancestor did not experience this. Not because ancient humans always ended up with the right person. Not because ancient partnerships were always happy or fulfilling or easy. But because the system that produced their partnerships was so fundamentally different from the one we use today that the specific kind of regret we experience, the wondering about all the options we did not take, the comparison to idealized alternatives we never actually knew, was structurally, neurologically, almost completely impossible. This is the story of how ancient humans chose their partners, what the archaeological and anthropological evidence actually tells us about prehistoric mate selection, and why the system that replaced it, the modern romantic choice model, is producing something that the ancient brain was never designed to handle. Let's go. To understand ancient mate selection, you first have to discard almost everything modern culture has told you about what choosing a partner is supposed to look and feel like. The modern story goes something like this. You encounter a large pool of potential partners. You evaluate them based on attraction, compatibility, shared values, and personal preference. You select the best available option. You commit. And if it does not work out, you re-enter the pool and try again. This story is so familiar that it feels like a description of human nature. It is not. It is a description of a system that has existed in its current form for a remarkably short period of human history. And understanding what came before it requires going back, not hundreds of years, but hundreds of thousands. For the vast majority of human existence, mate selection did not look like modern dating. It did not involve encountering a large pool of strangers. It did not involve evaluating dozens or hundreds of potential partners. It did not involve the concept of romantic love as the primary criterion for partnership. And it absolutely did not produce the specific neurological experience of wondering whether you chose correctly from among many available alternatives. Because there were almost never many available alternatives to wonder about. Here is what the anthropological and archaeological evidence actually shows. In hunter-gatherer bands of between 30 and 150 individuals, the social unit within which humans lived for the overwhelming majority of our species' existence, the pool of potential mates was radically constrained, not by law, not by rigid cultural rules that prohibited choice, but by simple arithmetic and social structure. In a band of 150 people, roughly half are the opposite sex. Of those, a significant proportion are too old or too young for partnership. A significant proportion are already partnered. A significant proportion are close relatives, making partnership biologically inappropriate and almost universally socially prohibited. What remains, the realistic pool of potential partners for any given individual in an ancient band, is typically somewhere between 5 and 15 people. 5 to 15. Not 500, not the 47 possible matches that a modern dating app serves up on a Tuesday evening. 5 to 15 people, all of whom you have known for most of your life, whose strengths and weaknesses are completely visible to you, whose character has been demonstrated over years of shared daily life, and whose reputation in the group is a matter of common knowledge. In this world, the choice of a partner was not primarily a choice made by evaluating a large number of options. It was a process of recognition, of identifying among a small number of known individuals the one whose combination of practical value, social standing, personal character, and mutual attraction made them the most viable partner for the life you were actually going to live. And here is what that means for the psychology of the choice. When your entire pool of realistic options is 5 to 15 people you have known for years, people whose real character, real flaws, and real capabilities are visible to you, the comparison problem that drives modern romantic regret essentially does not exist. Modern romantic regret is almost always driven by one of two things. The first is the comparison to idealized alternatives. the sense that somewhere out there is a better partner, more compatible, more attractive, more everything, and that you might have chosen them if only the circumstances had been different. The second is the comparison to idealized versions of your actual partner as they were early in the relationship, the best version of them, the performed version, the version that existed before the daily reality of a shared life replaced the curated presentation of early romance. Ancient mate selection produced neither of these comparison structures. There was no vast, invisible pool of idealized alternatives to compare your partner against, because the actual pool was small and completely visible. And there was no dramatic performance of an idealized self in the early stages of the relationship, because there was no stage of the relationship in which the two people did not already know each other completely. You did not meet someone in ancient society. You recognized someone you had always known. But archaeologists have found something that makes this picture even more complex, and it challenges the romantic narrative in ways that most people find genuinely uncomfortable. For decades, the popular assumption about ancient human mating was essentially monogamous. One partner, committed for life. The evidence was more complicated. Across a wide range of hunter-gatherer societies studied by anthropologists, from the Hadza of Tanzania to the Aceh of Paraguay to the Agta of the Philippines, the picture that emerges is not simple monogamy, but something more nuanced that anthropologists call serial monogamy or flexible pair bonding. Most hunter-gatherer societies do practice some form of pair bonding, two individuals forming a partnership for the purposes of child-rearing and mutual support, but the permanence of that bond varies considerably across cultures and individuals. Divorce, in the sense of dissolving a partnership and forming a new one, is common and relatively straightforward in most documented hunter-gatherer societies. There is nothing in the ancient record that suggests our ancestors suffered through unhappy partnerships out of cultural obligation or religious prohibition. Partnerships that did not serve the individuals or the group were ended and reformed. What is absent, however, is the specific modern form of regret that comes from what psychologists call the paradox of choice. The documented finding that increasing the number of available options does not increase satisfaction with the option chosen. It decreases it. Barry Schwartz, a psychologist at Swarthmore College, documented this paradox extensively in his research published in the early 2000s. His finding, supported by decades of subsequent research, is counterintuitive but robust. When people have more choices, they are less satisfied with the choice they make. Not more satisfied, less. Because more choices produce more opportunities for comparison, more awareness of alternatives, and more susceptibility to the feeling that the option you selected might not be the best one available. In the ancient mate selection environment, the paradox of choice could not operate at full force. The pool was too small, the alternatives were too visible and too known, and the social context of the partnership was too immediate and practical for the abstract comparison to idealized invisible alternatives to take hold. Think about what actually drove ancient mate selection, based on what the evidence from surviving hunter-gatherer societies consistently shows. Practical capability was paramount. Could this person hunt, or gather, or build, or care for children? These were not abstract personality traits assessed through conversation. They were demonstrated daily competencies visible to everyone in the group. You did not have to wonder whether your potential partner was reliable, skilled, or hardworking. You had watched them be reliable, skilled, or hardworking. Or not, for years. Social standing and alliances mattered enormously. Whom you partnered with determined your position in the social network of the band, your access to resources through reciprocal exchange, and your children's social positioning from birth. Partnership was not just a personal choice. It was a political act, in the original sense, an act that organized the social world. Mutual attraction was real and recognized. Anthropologists studying hunter-gatherer mate selection consistently observe that personal preference and physical attraction play a genuine role. Ancient humans were not purely pragmatic. They felt desire, formed attachments, and cared about whom they spent their lives with. But this attraction operated within a context that constrained it. The small pool, the complete prior knowledge, the social stakes, in ways that prevented it from becoming the primary and sufficient basis for a decision that modern culture increasingly treats it as. And then everything changed. Not overnight, not with a single invention or a single moment, but with a series of developments that, over the course of the last several thousand years and accelerating dramatically in the last 2 centuries, completely transformed the architecture within which human mate selection occurred. The first great transformation was agriculture, when humans shifted from mobile hunter-gatherer life to settled agricultural communities approximately 10,000 years ago. Population density increased dramatically. You were no longer living with 30 to 150 familiar people. You were living in villages of hundreds, then towns of thousands, then cities of tens of thousands. The pool of potential partners expanded dramatically. So did the complexity of the choice. But agricultural societies also introduced powerful social constraints on mate selection, formal marriage systems, family arrangements, property considerations, religious requirements that, while often restrictive and frequently unjust, did at least limit the pool of options and reduce the comparison problem. You might not have chosen your partner freely, but the specific modern regret that comes from comparing your actual partner to a vast invisible pool of idealized alternatives was still limited by the fact that the alternatives were not truly infinite. The second transformation was industrialization. When the Industrial Revolution dismantled traditional community structures, dispersed populations from their places of origin, and began concentrating people in anonymous urban environments, several things happened simultaneously. The social constraints on mate selection weakened dramatically. The pool of potential partners expanded to include, for the first time in human history, large numbers of genuine strangers. And the cultural narrative of romantic love as the supreme criterion for partnership selection, a narrative that had existed as a literary ideal for centuries, began for the first time to function as an actual operational guide for how ordinary people chose their life partners. This was genuinely new. For the first time, large numbers of ordinary people were selecting life partners primarily on the basis of romantic feeling for a relative stranger, with minimal prior knowledge of that person's actual character and capabilities, in the context of a dramatically expanded pool of alternatives. The conditions for the paradox of choice were fully assembled. The third transformation, and the most dramatic, was the digital revolution and the rise of online dating. When matching algorithms began offering users hundreds or thousands of potential partners organized by photograph and curated self-presentation, the pool of apparent alternatives became effectively infinite. The human brain, which evolved to navigate a mate selection environment of 5 to 15 known individuals, was suddenly being asked to choose from a display of unlimited options, none of whom were known, all of whom were presenting idealized versions of themselves, and all of whom generated the implicit question, might one of the others be better? Research on online dating and relationship satisfaction has produced findings that would be entirely predictable to any evolutionary psychologist. People who meet their partners online are exposed to dramatically more options. They tend to report higher initial satisfaction. More choice feels like more control. But they also report higher rates of what researchers call consideration of alternatives, the ongoing mental comparison of your actual partner to other potential partners, which is one of the strongest documented predictors of relationship dissolution. The brain has not changed. It is still running ancient mate selection software designed for a world of 5 to 15 known individuals, but the environment it is navigating has changed beyond anything in human evolutionary experience. And the mismatch produces the specific modern experience that ancient humans essentially never had, the persistent wondering whether you made the right choice. There is one more piece of this story that the archaeological record illuminates in a way that surprises most people: the role of the group in ancient mate selection. Modern mate selection is, by design and by cultural ideology, a private choice between two individuals. Whom you partner with is, in the dominant modern view, your business and nobody else's. External opinions, from family, from friends, from community, are often experienced as interference to be resisted rather than information to be welcomed. In the ancient world, the selection of a partner was explicitly and intentionally a social process, not because ancient society was oppressive or because individuals had no agency, but because the group had direct practical stakes in every partnership formed within it. Who partnered with whom affected resource distribution, child-rearing capacity, social alliances, and group cohesion. Everyone in the band had relevant information about every potential pairing, and that information was both freely shared and genuinely useful. Anthropologists studying hunter-gatherer mate selection consistently observe that while individuals make the ultimate choice, the process is embedded in a social context of opinion, discussion, advice, and collective assessment that modern individuals would find intrusive to a degree they might find difficult to accept. Other members of the group actively participate in evaluating potential matches. They share what they know. They express preferences. They sometimes strongly discourage pairings they believe would be harmful. This might sound like an infringement on individual freedom, but from the perspective of the cognitive science of decision-making, it is something else. It is a distributed information processing system that brings to bear on a high-stakes decision far more relevant real-world information than any individual can access alone. The group knew things about every potential partner that no brief personal acquaintance could reveal, because the group had watched that person live their actual life over years under real conditions in real situations. Modern mate selection has largely eliminated this distributed social intelligence from the process. We choose alone, or with minimal input from people who actually know the candidates. We evaluate based on brief exposure, curated self-presentation, and the chemistry of early attraction. And we do so in the context of a theoretically unlimited field of alternatives that our ancient brains were never designed to evaluate. The result is predictable, not because people are choosing badly in some individual moral sense, but because the system they are using to choose, the expanded pool, the private decision, the romantic chemistry as primary criterion, the comparison to idealized invisible alternatives, is producing outcomes that the ancient mate selection system, with its small pool of known individuals and embedded social intelligence, was largely able to avoid. Does this mean ancient humans had better marriages? That is the wrong question. Ancient partnerships operated in a completely different context. There was no privacy. There was no idealized romantic narrative promising continuous passionate fulfillment. There were no easy exits into a new pool of alternatives. Partnership was embedded in survival in a way that made its character completely different from modern marriage. But the specific modern experience of lying awake and wondering whether you chose the wrong person, wondering against a backdrop of infinite theoretical alternatives, against an idealized early relationship that was partly performance, against a cultural narrative that told you that the right partner should make you perpetually happy. That specific experience, driven by that specific cognitive and cultural architecture, was not something your ancient ancestor experienced. Not because ancient partnerships were perfect, but because the system that produced them did not generate the comparison structure that makes modern regret possible. Yet the biggest question this raises is still waiting. If the ancient system worked better, or at least produced less of this specific kind of suffering, can we learn anything useful from it? Or is the knowledge purely historical? The honest answer is that you cannot reconstruct the ancient mate selection environment. You cannot reduce the pool to 15 known individuals. You cannot eliminate the cultural narrative of romantic love as the supreme criterion. You cannot reinstate the group's role as an embedded social intelligence in the process of partner selection. But you can recognize what the research consistently shows: that the partners people describe as most satisfying over the long term are, more often than not, people they knew for a significant period before partnership began. People whose real character, not their performed dating persona, was visible before the commitment was made. People whose practical capabilities and genuine flaws were known, not discovered later as a betrayal of expectation. You can recognize that the feeling of wondering whether you chose correctly is not evidence that you chose incorrectly. It is evidence of a brain operating in a choice environment that exceeds its evolutionary design. The wondering is not a signal from reality. It is a signal from an ancient cognitive system that was built for certainty and is struggling to achieve it in conditions of infinite alternatives. And you can recognize that the social intelligence your ancient ancestors brought to mate selection, the embedded community knowledge about who people really are, is still available to you if you are willing to use it. The opinions of people who know you and know your partner and who have watched both of you in real conditions over real time carry information that no algorithm and no brief personal encounter can generate. Ancient humans never had regret about who they married because their world made the regret neurologically difficult to sustain. The pool was known, the alternatives were visible and limited. The social context made comparison to idealized invisible options nearly impossible. And the practical demands of the life they shared left little cognitive space for the abstract wondering that modern comfort and optionality make possible. Your world made all of those conditions disappear. It gave you more choice than any human brain in evolutionary history has ever navigated. And more choice, as the evidence consistently shows, does not produce more certainty. It produces more wondering. The question your ancient ancestor never had to ask is the one you may be asking right now, not because you chose wrong, but because the system you used to choose was designed for a world that no longer exists, and was never designed for the one you are actually living in.